The cafe air tasted of burnt espresso and rain, slicked wool. Across the table, Julian Vane sat with terrifying stillness. He was a man made of sharp angles and expensive fabric. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like dry glass. My husband was currently in a hotel with Julian's wife. I leaned forward, my voice a jagged whisper. I want to divorce my cheating husband, but the husband of the other woman showed up and gave me $100 million. Saying don't divorce him just yet. Just wait for 3 more months. The black briefcase sat on the floor between us like a dormant bomb. Julian did not blink. He pushed a single, handwritten ledger across the scarred wood. It listed dates, times, and specific hotel room numbers. My hands shook as I recognized the Tuesday nights Ethan claimed were for late meetings. Julian's eyes were cold, reflecting the gray Chicago skyline. He explained that a corporate merger required his wife to maintain a clean image for 90 days. He was not asking for my silence. He was buying my tactical cooperation. I returned to our quiet suburban home that evening. The foyer smelled of the vanilla candles Ethan bought whenever he felt guilty. He was on the sofa, scrolling through his phone with a lazy smile. I felt the weight of the hidden bank slip in my coat pocket. It was more money than I could earn in 3 lifetimes. Ethan looked up and asked about my day. I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. He had no idea that his wife was now a paid mercenary. Weeks passed in a blurred haze of domestic theater. I cooked his favorite meals while Julian sent me encrypted files of Ethan's secret bank transfers. My husband was slowly draining our joint retirement fund to pay for a condo in Evanston. He thought he was being clever. He thought I was the same knave girl he married 7 years ago. Every night, I lay beside him and listened to his rhythmic breathing. I realized that the man I loved had never actually existed. He was just a collection of rehearsed lies. The pressure peaked during a charity gala in the 2nd month. I wore a silk dress that felt like armor. I watched Ethan and Sarah share a lingering look across the crowded ballroom. Julian stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my arm. We were the only 2 people in the room who knew the truth. Sarah laughed, her diamonds catching the light, completely unaware that her husband was documenting her downfall. I felt a surge of cold power. The $100 million was no longer a bribe. It was my war chest. On the final morning, Ethan packed a suitcase for his supposed business trip to Florida. I helped him fold his shirts, smoothing the fabric with steady fingers. He kissed my cheek and promised to call when he landed. I watched his car pull out of the driveway for the last time. My phone buzzed with a message from Julian. The merger was signed, and the legal trap was set. I walked to the kitchen and picked up the phone to call my lawyer. The 3 months were finally over. The lawyer's office was a sterile vault of glass and steel. I sat on the edge of the leather chair, clutching the evidence Julian had provided. My attorney, a woman named Claire, flipped through the photographs with clinical indifference. She stopped at a shot of Ethan carrying a box into the Evanston condo. The clock on her wall ticked like a countdown. She told me we had enough for a filing, but the financial split remained a treacherous battlefield. Ethan returned from his trip 3 days later, smelling of ocean salt and a floral perfume I didn't own. He dropped his bags in the hall and hugged me with practiced warmth. I felt my skin crawl as his hands rested on my waist. He handed me a small gift box from a boutique in Tampa. Inside was a gold bracelet that looked remarkably like the one Sarah wore at the gala. I thanked him quietly, wondering if he even noticed the repetition. I began my daily audit while Ethan showered that evening. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, masquerading as a diligent worker. Julian had sent a new link to a shared drive containing Ethan's recent credit card statements. I found a recurring charge for a storage unit I had never seen. The location was only 2 miles from our house. It was a physical manifestation of his secret life. I realized then that he was already moving out. The following morning, I drove to the storage facility under a bruised, purple sky. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the unit number Julian had flagged. I used a spare key I found in Ethan's gym bag. The door rolled up with a deafening metallic screech. Inside were boxes of his old records, a leather chair, and several framed photos of us. He wasn't just hiding a mistress. He had curated a graveyard for our entire 7-year marriage. I heard a car pull into the gravel lot behind me. I ducked behind a stack of crates, my breath coming in shallow hitches. Through a gap in the wood, I saw Ethan's silver sedan come to a halt. He didn't look like a man in love. He looked haggard and rushed as he checked his watch. He opened a trunk and pulled out a heavy safe. He began hauling it toward the unit. His face strained with the sudden effort. He didn't see me crouched in the shadows. He placed the safe in the far corner and covered it with a dusty tarp. He whispered a name under his breath, but it wasn't mine or Sarah's. He called out to someone named Marcus. I stayed motionless until the sound of his engine faded into the distance. I stepped out and pulled back the tarp. The safe was brand new and bore the logo of his logistics company's main competitor. I used my phone to photograph the serial number on the heavy steel door. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. Ethan was stealing corporate secrets to leverage his own future. I sent the image to Julian immediately. Within seconds, my phone buzzed with a frantic reply. Julian told me to leave the facility at once. He said the game had changed because Marcus was the man currently handling Julian's multi-million-dollar merger. My husband was playing us both. I fled the storage facility as the first drops of rain hit the gravel. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Julian's warning echoed in my mind like a siren. If Marcus was involved, this was no longer a simple domestic betrayal. It was industrial espionage. I pulled into a supermarket parking lot to catch my breath. The neon sign flickered, casting a sickly green light over my dashboard. I was a pawn in a much larger game. Ethan was home when I arrived, whistling a tune while he polished his dress shoes. The sight of his domestic normancy made my stomach churn with bile. He looked up and asked why I looked so pale. I blamed the cold rain and walked straight to the kitchen. I needed to act before he noticed my gym bag was missing a key. He followed me, leaning against the doorframe with a casual grace that felt predatory. He was watching me closely. "You've been spending a lot of time out lately," Ethan remarked, his voice smooth and low. I kept my back to him while I poured a glass of water. I told him I was just clearing my head with long drives. He didn't move. The silence between us stretched until it felt like a physical weight. He reached out and tucked a stray hair behind my ear. His touch felt like a threat. He knew I was hiding something from him. My phone vibrated on the counter, the screen flashing Julian's name. I lunged for it, but Ethan was faster. He snatched the device and stared at the caller ID with a furrowed brow. He asked me who Julian was. I felt my heart drop into my shoes as I scrambled for a plausible lie. I told him he was a new client from the localization firm. Ethan laughed. A short and dry sound. He didn't believe a word I said. He handed the phone back but kept his hand on the counter, blocking my exit. He told me he didn't like strangers calling his wife at dinner time. I saw a flash of genuine anger in his eyes, for the first time in years. The mask of the reliable husband was finally slipping away. He wasn't just worried about his affair. He was worried about his secrets. I realized then that Ethan was terrified of being caught by someone like Julian. I waited until he went to bed to check the message. Julian had sent a single address and a time for tomorrow morning. It was a private airfield on the outskirts of the city. He said we needed to move the safe before Ethan could hand it over to Marcus. My role was to provide the key and the distraction. I looked at the sleeping man beside me. He looked so peaceful for a thief. I was walking into a trap. The next morning, I found a second phone hidden in the lining of Ethan's suitcase. It wasn't encrypted. I opened the messages and saw a string of texts from Sarah. She wasn't talking about love or their future together. She was giving him coordinates for a drop-off in the city. The affair was the cover story for the theft. Julian hadn't just given me money to wait. He had given me a front row seat to my own husband's ultimate betrayal. I reached the airfield before dawn, the asphalt glowing under sodium lights. Wind whipped through the chain link fence, whistling like a warning. Julian stood beside a sleek, silver jet, his face a mask of granite. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply held out his hand for the key I had stolen from Ethan's gym bag. I felt like a traitor to a man who had already betrayed me. Julian took the cold metal, his fingers brushing mine. "The safe is empty," Julian said, his voice cutting through the roar of a distant engine. My heart stopped. I told him I saw Ethan put it there only yesterday. Julian shook his head, showing me a digital photo on his tablet. The interior was hollow. Stripped of the drive Marcus wanted. Ethan had moved the data before I even left the storage lot. He wasn't just lying to me. He was playing a deeper game against Julian. The sound of a car tearing across the gravel interrupted us. I turned to see Ethan's sedan skidding to a halt near the hangar. He stepped out, but he wasn't alone. Sarah was in the passenger seat, her face pale behind the glass. Ethan held a small, black external drive in his hand. He looked at Julian with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He knew we were here. He had tracked my phone from the kitchen. "You really thought 100 million would keep her quiet?" Ethan shouted over the wind. He walked toward us, using the drive as leverage. I realized Julian's grand plan had a massive leak. Ethan had known about the bribe for weeks. He let me keep the money because it kept me distracted, while he finalized his deal with Marcus. My husband had used my own greed against me. I felt the weight of the bank slip turn into lead. Julian didn't look surprised. He stepped forward, his posture relaxed despite the escalating tension. He told Ethan that Marcus was already in federal custody for corporate fraud. Ethan's smirk vanished instantly. The drive in his hand was no longer a golden ticket. It was a piece of incriminating evidence. Sarah climbed out of the car, looking ready to run. She looked at Julian with genuine terror. The power dynamic shifted in a single silent heartbeat. Ethan lunged at Julian, but two men in dark suits appeared from the hangar. They intercepted him before he could land a blow. The drive skittered across the pavement, stopping near my boots. I looked down at the plastic casing. It contained the secrets of 2 major companies and the end of my marriage. I picked it up, feeling the sharp edges dig into my palm. I had the power to end this right now. "Give it to me, Maya?" Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. He looked small and pathetic between the 2 guards. I looked at Julian, then back at my husband. I realized they were both using me to secure their own futures. I didn't belong to either side of this war. I tucked the drive into my pocket and walked toward my car. I was done being a pawn. I was taking the money and the evidence. I drove away from the airfield as the sun finally broke the horizon. The black drive sat on the passenger seat, a silent witness to my escape. I could see the lights of the city flickering in my rearview mirror. Julian did not follow me. But I knew his reach was long. He had invested too much to let me vanish with the data. My hands finally stopped, shaking as I reached the outskirts of the downtown loop. The drive led me to a small, windowless data recovery shop in River North. I had visited this place once before for a localization project. The owner, a man named Silas, looked at the drive with professional curiosity. He plugged it into a shielded terminal and began bypass protocols. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. My stomach twisted with every percentage point. I needed to know what Ethan was hiding before the lawyers arrived. Silas whistled as the file structure appeared on the monitor. He pointed to a folder titled Project Aegis. It contained blueprints for a new logistics automation system that Julian's company was developing. But there was something else buried in the subdirectories. A series of encrypted emails showed Sarah was the one who initiated the contact with Marcus. Ethan was not the mastermind behind the theft. He was merely the courier Sarah used to protect herself. I felt a sudden chill as a dark SUV pulled up outside the shop. Two men stepped out, and I recognized the tailored suits from the hangar. They didn't knock, they simply walked through the front door with practiced ease. Silas tried to protest, but one man placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. They weren't looking for him. They were looking for the drive. Julian had tracked the device the moment Silas connected it to the internet. "You are making a mistake, Maya," the taller man said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't reach for a weapon, but his presence was enough of a threat. I grabbed the drive from the terminal and backed away. I told them I would destroy it if they took another step. They paused, weighing my resolve against their orders. I saw the reflection of the streetlights in their sunglasses. They knew I was desperate enough to do it. Just then my phone buzzed with a video call from Julian. I answered it, holding the screen up so the men could see. Julian was sitting in a darkened office, his face illuminated by a laptop glow. He told me that Ethan had already confessed everything to the police. Sarah had vanished, taking a portion of Julian's offshore funds with her. The drive in my hand was the only thing left that could track her location. I looked at the screen and then at the men standing in the shop. Julian wasn't trying to protect his company anymore. He was hunting his wife. He offered me another $50 million to hand over the drive immediately. I realized the original $100 million was just the beginning of his desperation. I gripped the plastic casing until it bit into my palm. I told Julian I wanted the divorce finalized by noon today. He nodded once and disconnected. The legal machinery moved with a terrifying, silent speed. Julian's influence cut through the typical court, delays like a hot blade through wax. By 11 in the morning, I stood in a private judge's chambers. The air was cold and smelled of old parchment and floor wax. Ethan sat across from me, looking like a ghost of the man I once loved. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the black drive resting on the judge's desk. The judge reviewed the digital files I had provided. Each document was a nail in the coffin of our marriage. The logs showed the secret condo, the diverted funds, and the communications with Marcus. Ethan's defense had completely crumbled under the weight of Julian's documented evidence. There were no outbursts or dramatic pleas. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the scratching of a fountain pen. I felt a strange, hollow victory rising in my chest as the ink dried. "Your client has no leverage left," my attorney said, leaning forward. She pointed to the post-nuptial agreement Ethan had signed during our second month of pretense. It was a masterpiece of legal deception. By signing it, Ethan had unknowingly forfeited his claim to all marital assets in the event of proven infidelity. He had thought he was protecting his future wealth from me. Instead, he had handed me the keys to everything we owned. He looked at the paper with genuine horror. Ethan finally spoke, his voice cracking like dry wood. He asked how I could live with myself after playing him for 90 days. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the gold bracelet still shimmering on my wrist, the one he bought to mimic Sarah's. I told him that I simply followed the rules he had created. He had taught me that loyalty was a luxury and silence was a weapon. He flinched as if I had struck him across the face. The judge looked up from the folders and adjusted his spectacles. He noted the unusual nature of the $100 million transfer from Julian's accounts. Ethan's lawyer tried to argue it was a marital asset that should be split. I held my breath, waiting for the final blow. My attorney presented a signed affidavit from Julian Vane. It stated the funds were a private gift to me for services, rendered as an independent consultant. The judge nodded slowly, accepting the legal distinction. Just as the final decree was stamped, a court bailiff entered the room. He whispered something to the judge and handed over a small, sealed envelope. The judge's expression shifted from professional boredom to sharp concern. He looked at me, then at Ethan, with a renewed intensity. He asked if either of us knew the current whereabouts of Sarah Vane. Ethan shook his head vigorously, his panic returning. I stayed silent, thinking of the encrypted coordinates I had seen on the drive. The judge revealed that Sarah had been found at a private marina an hour ago. She hadn't vanished. She had been detained while trying to board a yacht registered to Ethan's logistics company. This news hit Ethan like a physical blow. He lunged across the table, shouting that he didn't know anything about a boat. The bailiffs moved quickly, pinning him against the heavy oak table. My husband's desperation had finally boiled over into a public, humiliating scene. I watched him struggle. The yacht was purchased with the company's missing funds. The bailiff added. This changed the entire scope of the divorce settlement. The assets I had just won were now potentially subject to a federal seizure. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at my lawyer. She was already scribbling notes, her face pale. Julian had played me again. He knew the money he gave me would be safe, but the house and the savings were now tainted. I grabbed the black drive from the judge's desk before anyone could protest. The coordinates on the disk were for a second location, not the marina. Sarah had used the yacht as a decoy to draw the authorities away from her real escape route. Ethan was just a distraction for everyone, including the police. I realized Sarah was the only one who truly knew how to disappear. Julian's obsession with her had blinded him to her actual plan. I had the real map. I walked out of the courtroom, while the bailiffs were still struggling with Ethan. The hallway was empty and echoed with the sound of my heels. I felt the weight of the $100 million and the plastic drive. I was free of Ethan, but I was now the only person who could find Sarah. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a new message from a blocked number. It was a photo of my front door. Sarah was waiting for me at home. I drove through the city like a woman possessed by a ghost. The afternoon light turned a bruised purple against the glass skyscrapers. My house stood at the end of a quiet cull, D-sack, looking deceptively peaceful. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. Sarah Vane was inside. The woman who had dismantled my world and Julian's empire. I checked my purse for the black drive and the heavy brass keys. The air felt thick with the scent of coming rain. I stepped through the front door into a house that no longer felt like mine. The vanilla candles had burned down to pools of cold wax. Sarah was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking tea from my favorite ceramic mug. She wore a simple trench coat and looked remarkably calm for a fugitive. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight, professional knot. She didn't look like a mistress or a thief. She looked like a woman who had finally won. "You took your time getting here, Maya," Sarah said softly. She didn't stand up to greet me. I kept my distance, leaning against the kitchen counter with my hand over the drive. I asked her why she was in my home. She smiled. A small and sad expression that made my heart hammer. She told me the yacht at the marina was a trap for Julian. He was too predictable in his rage. She needed me to help her reach the real exit. I told her I had already won my divorce and my freedom. I didn't owe her anything but a call to the police. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. She slid it across the table toward me. It contained a list of dates and bank account numbers. They were not Julian's accounts or Ethan's. They belonged to my own father, who had been dead for 10 years. My blood turned to ice. Sarah knew things about my past. My father's poverty had been a lie he told to protect us. The notebook detailed a series of trust funds that Ethan had discovered years ago. He hadn't just cheated on me with Sarah. He had been slowly siphoning away an inheritance I never knew existed. Sarah wasn't his partner in a crime against Julian. She was the one who had stopped him from taking everything. She had been protecting my interests while playing her own husband. The power dynamic in the room shattered. I needed the 3 months to move the money back. Sarah explained. She stood up and walked toward the window. Julian's $100 million was just a fraction of what Ethan had stolen over the years. Sarah had used her affair as a smokescreen to access Ethan's private servers. She had redirected the flow of my father's wealth back into an account only I could access. I looked at the drive in my hand. It wasn't evidence of a theft. It was the key. I realized then why Julian was so desperate to find her. He wasn't hunting a cheating wife. He was hunting the person who had exposed his own complicity in Ethan's schemes. Julian had helped Ethan hide the trust funds in exchange for corporate secrets. They were two sides of the same corrupt coin. Sarah had betrayed them both to set me free. I felt a wave of dizzying clarity. My marriage had been a long, slow robbery orchestrated by the man I trusted. A shadow moved across the driveway outside. Julian's dark SUV had arrived, silent and menacing. Sarah looked at me with an urgent intensity. She told me there was a car waiting in the alleyway behind the garden. I had to choose between the man who bought my silence and the woman who stole my secrets. I grabbed the notebook and the drive, shoving them into my coat. The front door groaned as Julian began to force his way inside the house. We moved through the laundry room and out into the damp afternoon air. The rain began to fall in heavy, cold sheets. We reached the alley just as a black sedan pulled alongside the curb. Sarah opened the door and motioned for me to get inside. I hesitated, looking back at the house that held my old life. Julian appeared at the gate, his face contorted with a cold and familiar fury. He screamed my name. I didn't look back again. I climbed into the car and Sarah slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and we accelerated away from the cul-de-sac. I looked at the leather notebook in my lap. It was the only thing I had left from a father I never truly knew. Sarah sat beside me, staring out at the blurred city lights. She handed me a burner phone with a single contact saved. It was a lawyer in Zurich. My life was finally moving forward with intention. The sedan reached the city limits as the rain turned into a blinding deluge. Sarah remained silent, her eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. I opened the leather notebook and traced my father's signature. The ink was old, but the truth was fresh and jagged. My father hadn't died in debt. He had died protecting a fortune from men like Julian. I looked at the black drive in my hand. It was the digital skeleton key to every lie I had lived. We stopped at a nondescript motel near the state line. The neon sign buzzed with a dying electricity that hummed in my teeth. Sarah handed me a thick envelope containing a new passport and a flight itinerary. She told me the $100 million was only the start of my restitution. The Zurich accounts held the real weight of my inheritance. I realized then that Sarah wasn't my savior. She was the custodian of my father's final wish. She had waited for me to grow strong. I walked to the motel window and watched a lone car park across the street. The headlights remained on, cutting through the misty rain like twin daggers. It wasn't Julian's SUV. It was a local police cruiser. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized Julian had reported the drive as stolen property. I was now a fugitive in the eyes of the law. Sarah grabbed her bag and moved toward the back exit. We were running out of time and road. "They aren't here for me," Sarah whispered, her voice devoid of emotion. She pointed to the laptop screen she had just opened. A news alert showed Ethan's face under a headline about corporate espionage and murder. The authorities believed he had killed Marcus to cover his tracks. Julian had successfully framed my ex-husband for the entire conspiracy. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. Julian wasn't just hunting us. He was erasing every witness to his own dark past. I dialed the number for the Zurich lawyer as the police began knocking on the motel doors. A man answered with a voice like polished stone. I gave him the code from my father's notebook and the serial number from the drive. He confirmed that the transfer was already in progress. The money was moving. But the truth was still trapped in this room. I looked at Sarah and saw a flash of fear in her eyes. She knew Julian would never stop. The police reached our door and demanded entry with a heavy thud. I tucked the drive into my boot and stood tall. I realized that my father's lie was finally over. I didn't need a husband or a benefactor to define my worth. I opened the door and faced the flashing red and blue lights. Behind the officers, I saw Julian standing in the shadows, watching me with a smug grin. He thought he had won. He didn't know I had already sent the data.